All right, folks, hop in the time machine. We are going back to 1979. This is going to be good.
An exchange of views by the leaders of Canada's three major political parties on the issues of the 1979 federal election. The moderator tonight is the distinguished lawyer and academic, Dean of the Faculty of Law at the University of Western Ontario, and incoming principal or president of University, David Johnston.
Good evening.
Ooh, the chair spin. That was a nice touch.
I'm honored to preside for the next 2 hours over this historic meeting. For the first and only time in this election campaign, the leaders of Canada's three major political parties have gathered together to confront each other.
I honestly have no idea who any of these guys are. Ed Broadbent, Joe Clark. This is all before my time. I wasn't even alive when this debate happened.
On the issues which now concern the nation. This unique occasion for voters from coast to coast has been arranged by the parties and the pooled efforts of the CBC, CTV, and global television networks. The parties and the networks have agreed on the following format.
This leaders debate format is actually really good.
Members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, I very much enjoyed the opportunity over the last several years, really now, to get out across the country to talk to
Is this Joe Clark?
many of you about the issues that you feel face our country. What I wanted to do tonight in opening this portion of the debate was to speak about some of the goals which my colleagues and I think the country, working together, should be able to achieve in the next 4 years. I start
There's no way that's his real hair.
with the understanding that we're very fortunate to live in a nation like Canada. Not only do we have tremendous physical resources, and in fact,
Come on, that's so obviously a weave or a wig or something. Like there is no way anybody has hair like that. That's not real hair.
a physical potential, a resource potential that no other nation in the world can match. But we also have skilled individuals, and we have people who are living and
This guy's got a massive forehead too, and is his head rectangular? I don't even think this guy's human.
working within a tradition of wanting to go out and build this country. We also have here in Canada institutions which have worked very well in this country when they've been given the chance to work. Now, in the last 11 years, things have not been going as well as they should. There's a lot we have to change, but mainly that has to be in the attitudes and the policies of the Ottawa government. In the last 11 years, we've seen a government in Ottawa that has encouraged Canadians to be divided one against another.
So is he? Who was prime minister even in the last 11 years? Probably Trudeau, right? I don't think Broadbent ever was prime minister. So this must be what Trudeau loses and Joe Clark wins, or what? Or just Trudeau? Who knows?
Has created divisions and allowed divisions to develop more severe than at any time in our history as a country. We've allowed unemployment in Canada to rise to levels which I personally find simply unacceptable for a nation of our wealth, a nation of our...
Okay, let's check that out. Actually, it's funny that he says that because, okay, I just looked it up. So, yeah, Trudeau, Pierre Elliott, the senior, the first, was prime minister. Joe Clark wins the election, and then unemployment shoots up to 12%. And I guess he probably loses the next election. Oh no, Joe Clark was only prime minister for 1 year. I guess he had like a minority and he was defeated. They should teach this in school. Okay, so what happened was, all right, unemployment in 1979, it was pretty high. Well, it was 7.3%, 8.2 in 1978. So that's not far from the 6.8 that we're at today, but like it is kind of high. It is too high, I guess. And then so Joe Clark was prime minister very briefly, and then it reached 11.6%, 10.8 and 11.6 under Trudeau. That's really high. So apparently there was a recession in 1982. Interestingly enough, it was a stagflation, an inflationary recession, which, according to the whole Keynesian system, shouldn't even happen because apparently there's a trade off between unemployment and inflation. But in the early 80s, the interest rate was at 21%, the Bank of Canada interest rate, and inflation was at like 12%. Unemployment we see here at 12% as well. So this is really interesting, actually. I've got here the Bank of Canada overnight rate and sort of trending upwards until 1981, when all the way up to 21%, like the highest in the history of the nation. And inflation at that point was really high. It was at 10%. So I think what happened was basically the same thing that happened in the States during this time period, is that there was like steady monetary expansion during the 50s and 60s. And they thought, wow, this is great. No more recessions. Everything's going smoothly. We'll just keep inflating. And we got the whole situation under control. And then, but you can't just keep doing that. Uh, Eventually, there are consequences. And what happened was the whole system started to collapse in the 1970s because the effect of all this expansion of the money supply, was creating new money, started to manifest in the form of inflation. And then at the same time, you had a recession. And that was unheard of before the 70s. Stagflation wasn't really a thing when you had a recession and really high unemployment. And then I guess this carried on into the 80s. So it's like the same sort of consequence. So these guys blame the oil crisis. So here's the asset sheet for the Bank of Canada, because the primary mechanism for increasing the money supply, as far as I know, is the Bank of Canada buying government bonds. And you see throughout the 70s, they're really steadily increasing the total holdings, and mostly government bonds here. This is bonds. Government bonds or bonds? Just bonds, but I think usually they just buy government bonds. It doesn't actually matter. Um, Although here in the 80s, they start to unload some, actually. They start to acquire short-term paper. All right, let's get back to the debate. So unemployment was at pretty high level, 8%. About to get a whole lot worse.
Our traditions. And we've seen the Trudeau government undermine institutions, whether the parliamentary system or the very effective way in which the federal-provincial relations have worked together in the past. We believe that a new government, formed by a new team of Canadians who are proud of this country, confident about this country, who represent the whole of Canada, will be much better able to deal with the problems and the opportunities arising in the next 4 years.
Why is your head tilted? Stand up straight.
Than the old government would. We'd follow mainly three
There you go.
main priorities. The first would be to restore the spirit of cooperation to federal-provincial relations in Canada. That has been there with every successful prime minister in our history, from Sir John A. Macdonald right through to Lester B. Pearson. I believe that what we need is a federal government that will be strong where it has to be strong, but that will be reasonable where it should be reasonable.
Look at those eyebrows. Man's got bushy eyebrows.
Next, we clearly have to get the Canadian economy growing much faster than it has been. We have to find jobs for that million Canadians who are now out of work. We have to find skills for those young Canadians who are looking for work don't have experience, don't have the skills they need. And finally, we have to build upon the great natural strengths of this country. That's the goal that my colleagues and I set for Canada. That's the goal we've been setting forward in this national...
In the spring election of 1979, Clark ran on a small C conservative platform that included tax and mortgage breaks and a proposal to privatize Petro-Canada. That sounds solid. Oh, Trudeau created Petro-Canada. I didn't know that. Apparently social credit was still a thing back in these days. There was 6 social credit MPs elected in the 79 election. All right, this is the platform for 1980. All right, even better, 1979. So, going on about unemployment here, and then the solution, they wanted to do tax cuts, duty remission scheme. I don't know what that is, but I guess cutting duty. Good. Well, the tar sands and heavy oil, but how? Gas pipeline from Montreal to Quebec City and the east. Tax policy. Merchant marine. I mean, it seems reasonable. A lot of tax cuts. Yeah, mostly just tax cuts, which is a good way to handle the problem. I gotta say, it seems like a pretty solid platform. It seems like Joe Clark, pretty good guy.
national election campaign. That's the goal which, with your help, we would want to begin to accomplish on the 22nd of May, working in partnership with you then and in the days of government afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. We now turn to the leader of the Liberal Party, Mr. Trudeau.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Gentlemen.
Yes.
Well, I'm happy to be in this debate, too. I know that the 3 of us have been traveling around the country for the past 7 weeks and talking to crowds, often to our own supporters. But we've never met like this, and I think that there are millions of people watching us who want to know how we approach this election. I see it as one about the future. I hope we will have in the half-hour debate occasion to look at the record a little bit and challenge some of these gloomy views of Mr. Clark. But I see the election about the future, about what kind of a Canada we want to have. And I think that's what the people want to hear in this election. Whether I'm on a campus or in a high school or in a senior citizen's home or meeting with working men and women, they say, well, what kind of a Canada will we have? What is the future like? What will our place be in it? How will we be able to retire in security?
I think Trudeau is a lot better of a public speaker than Joe Clark.
What about the young people? Will we be able to move and choose our place in this country? And our answer is, well, this election is meant to answer those kind of questions. Listen to the parties, listen to your candidates, and choose then those men and women who are able to put forward views of Canada and policies for it, which will make it strong, which will keep it united, and make it even more prosperous. And I hope once again that in the debate we'll be able to deal with the future more than with the past, though I'm very happy to deal with the record. But the future is what we want to talk about.
Thank you, Mr. Trudeau. Finally, we will hear from the leader of the New Democratic Party, Mr. Broadbent, please.
Good evening, Mr. Clark, Mr. Trudeau. Canadians out there, we are indeed entering the final phase of a very important election campaign. I've enjoyed traveling the past 7 weeks all over this country, meeting Canadians in every kind of occupation. And now, having had that pleasure and excitement, and it's been real for me, you have an opportunity to express very shortly an extremely serious opinion. You're going to have the right, important right, to decide which party and which man are best able to lead this country into a future that is going to be more decent and more exciting. In the past few weeks, I've been very precise about the things that we think ought to be done. I've said that when prices are going up much faster than wages and salaries, we need a Fair Prices Commission that can not only investigate rising prices, but when they're unjustifiably high, roll them back. I have said that we must...
Oh, no, that's price controls. No, the fault for inflation is the government. It's monetary policy. You got nothing to do with businesses charging too much. They're still talking about this trash like 80 years later, 40 years later, 50, 45 years later. I mean, these people do not understand economics. Like prices are determined by supply and demand. Uh, can't fault the merchant.
return to a system of universal Medicare so that there won't be one system of medical service for the rich and another for the poor. I have said that when people need housing, we have to do something about mortgages for middle and low-income Canadians, but we also have to do something for all those Canadians who need more rental accommodation. And I have also stressed for Canadian women that when they enter the labor market, they ought to have precisely the same rights as Canadian men. And for Western farmers who are anticipating with a great deal of eagerness increased export markets in the years ahead, I have said a government of Canada exercising its responsibility will make sure that we have a transportation system that will enable them to meet their export commitments. But above all in this campaign, for me, I think there's one issue that stands head and shoulders above the rest. And that is, I have urged my fellow Canadians that it's time that we established in this country of ours what's long existed in all the other modern nations of this world, in Western Europe, in Japan, in them all. And that's an industrial strategy. And for Canadians, an industrial strategy really means getting control of our own resources and ensuring that we here in Canada get the jobs from those resources.
Yeah, I definitely disagree about the merits of an industrial strategy. Look, what you need is a free market economy. You don't need the government telling companies what to produce or subsidizing firms or enabling protectionist measures to shield domestic producers from foreign competition. Laissez-faire capitalism, not government-controlled capitalism that benefits an elite few at the expense of ordinary citizens.
It's time that Canadian resources were owned by Canadians, controlled by Canadians, and used for the benefit of Canadians. It's time and...
So the problem I have with that point of view is, like, don't we need foreign investment in order to really tap a lot of our natural resources? Like, the conservation of natural resources in the first place doesn't really make sense to me because societies are almost invariably richer with the passage of time. So why should we abstain today for the benefit of future generations when they're already going to be twice or three times richer than we were? Instead, what makes more sense to me is to have economic development, to go out and build those mines, um, log those forests and extract the gas, create those jobs, and get those goods into the global marketplace. And yeah, in order to do that, we'll probably need substantial foreign investment from China, from the United States, wherever. So what? It's still going to be good for the Canadian economy. It's still going to create a lot of jobs, and we'll get those resources to market when they're helping people instead of just languishing there in the earth. We shouldn't be afraid of foreign ownership or foreign investment in Canada. That doesn't make sense. Look, if a foreign company comes to Canada and opens up a business, that's still a business that's going to employ Canadians. That's still investment in capital that is going to ultimately benefit our country. Why would I want to keep resources in the earth that have no benefit to me just so people 400 years from now, when the average income is, 500 times what it is today, so they can benefit and they can sell them. The global economy right now is hungry for natural resources. There's so many businesses that need them. Canada's really well positioned to benefit from that by getting all these mines going. They got to hire people. They have to, buy all this equipment that they're going to use. Presumably, a lot of that's going to be sold here. Either way, it's going to be here. Like if the mine shuts down, that equipment's going to get sold off, be used for other projects. Like industrial activity is a good thing. And there's tertiary benefits. All those workers have to eat. That food comes from, I presume, Canadian farmers. People stay at Canadian hotels, when they're on their way to the work site or when they have leave or whatever. I don't know all the details on how that works.
Short for a new beginning. It's time to bring Canada home to Canadians.
Thank you, Mr. Broadbent. Now that we've heard the opening statements from all three party leaders, we begin the first one-to-one encounter between Mr. Clark and Mr. Broadbent. Mr. Trudeau will not participate, but will remain at his place. Mr. Halton, you have the first question, please.
Thanks, Mr. Johnson. I'd like to start by asking Mr. Clark to explain what, for many Canadian voters, is a baffling contradiction in Tory policy. You blame Liberal spending and the large deficit right now for Canada's inflation. But you yourself, in the course of this campaign, have made promises that would, as you admit, increase the deficit. Aren't you on both sides of the fences on it?
Not at all. And I think that Mr. Broadbent will probably agree with the view that what we have to do to get an economy that is running now well below its potential, growing towards that full potential, is to introduce some stimulus right now. The kind of stimulus that a progressive conservative government wants to introduce is stimulus that would allow individual Canadians to begin spending some of their own money on things that they think are necessary in this country to begin to get growth. What we have to do is get the size of the economic pie, which governments can tax, growing much more near its full capacity than is now the case. There's nothing at all new about this. President Kennedy did it in the early 1960s with very positive effects, leading the United States from a deficit towards a surplus position. Indeed, John Turner did it in the budget of 1972, cutting taxes, giving money back to Canadians so they could spend that money in ways that would increase substantially the general wealth of the country and consequently bring more money into government. Now, we've specified some ways that will be, we think, very effective in doing that. We propose to allow Canadians to deduct a portion of their mortgage interest payments and of their property tax. We propose to allow to lower and middle income Canadians a tax cut averaging about $300 per taxpayer. Those are people who will use that money quickly in Canada to stimulate growth and purchase and activity in this country. We think it will generate new revenues for the government of Canada, which we would intend to use, not to create new spending, but to reduce the deficits that have accumulated over the last 11 years. And our goal...
Boom, that's perfect. Cut taxes, allow people to keep more of their money, spend more of their money, and cut the deficit, eliminate deficit spending. That's the right approach.
Very clearly, is to move this country towards a balanced budget. We think that we will be much closer to a balanced budget after 4 years of policy of that kind.
And by the way, I believe he is correct that deficit spending contributes to inflation so long as that deficit is financed through the banking system, through the Bank of Canada, as opposed to borrowing real savings in the form of like Canada savings bonds. I'm not sure exactly how the deficit financing at this time worked, but absolutely running deficits can contribute to inflation and hyperinflation for that matter.
Well, Mr. Clark, if I can come in on this point, what's bothered me particularly about your statement...
And by the way, a $20 billion deficit in 1979, that's pretty huge. Okay, I don't know about 1979, but 1978, total expenditures were 51 billion, and the deficit was 13 billion. This is extremely concerning. That is an absolutely massive deficit.
Mr. Stevens is that on the one hand, you've argued, yes, we should have a stimulating deficit budget of the kind that we have proposed and laid out very specific suggestions, which we have contended by having capital investment in energy projects now, housing projects now. We'd reduce unemployment insurance payouts. We'd increase tax revenue because people would be employed that aren't now employed. But we've been at least consistent in that. We haven't tried, in my view, to trick the people of Canada and say, on the one hand, yes, we will increase the deficit now, but at the same time have, in the case of Mr. Stevens, one of your financial spokesmen, and yourself on other occasions, say you would have a balanced budget. We have said categorically we can stimulate now. They have done it in other countries. They've done it in Western Europe recently, with a net effect, in fact, of 3 years of having an overall reduction in the budget. And what has bothered me about your approach to this campaign, frankly, is that you've seemed to try to have it both ways. You've said, yes, you can stimulate the budget, but simultaneously you and Mr. Stevens have said on different occasions you will have a balanced budget. Now, I for one, simply can't understand that contradiction.
Well, I think, Mr. Broadbent, you and I certainly agree on the goal, and certainly agree on the need for stimulus now. I think we probably disagree fundamentally about two things. One is whether it is most effective to have that stimulus through the private sector, which I believe, or have it more emphatically through the public sector with government spending money.
Clark, the question I'm posing with you, because I think it's an important question of credibility, is not that. There are differences there. We've come out for the private sector as well as public sector spending. You need both in a mixed economy. What I'm saying is I think it's very important to be candid in the election, and what I get from the Conservative campaign is a kind of trying to have it both ways. On the one hand, you're trying to say to all those Canadians who want a balanced budget now, yes, we'll have a balanced budget, and yet at the same time you're saying no. Now, I'd really like to know definitively where you stand on the issue. Are you saying you're going to have a balanced budget in the coming year or not?
I guess, Mr. Broadbent, I'll simply have to ask you to try a little harder to understand exactly what we're saying. What we're saying is that we would put a much greater reliance upon the private sector than you would, because we think that the likelihood of real stimulus, creating real jobs that will last, is going to be much more dramatic through the private sector. We think that that will generate the revenue base on which governments can draw. We think that whether it happens this year, it will certainly happen by the end of the first 4 years of a Conservative government, that we will have the deficit, the budget much nearer balance than it is right now. Now, I could discuss with you whether...
So you're saying you're going to have... it'll be nearer a balanced budget, but you're not prepared to say that you're going to increase the deficit in the coming year.
We expect that in the coming fiscal year, we expect that there will in fact not be a deepening of the deficit after the first full fiscal year. I can't predict that.
Well, I can't see how...
Just a second. Let me finish, if I might.
Yes.
We can't say that, as no one can, with absolute certainty, but our expectation is that there will be no increase in the deficit after the first fiscal year in which these measures are in operation. We think we will be able to generate enough growth quickly to broaden the tax base that will cause the revenues of the government of Canada to increase. Now, naturally, we're also going to be cutting some...
If I may...
See, I object with the whole goal of increasing government revenues in the first place. The goal should be to allow Canadians to keep more of their money. The best way to address a budget deficit isn't through cutting taxes in order to grow the economy or whatever, although that's certainly better than increasing government spending. But the best approach is to just reduce government spending in the first place so that your expenditures are in line with your revenue, and then decrease them both at the same time.
I just have to get a word in, Mr. Clark, that it's not only myself, but the Financial Post and every...
Well, this is a great little back and forth. This was excellent watching.
Newspaper in the financial section that I've read has disagreed with you. They said your proposal will, in fact, substantially increase the deficit this year, and I'm surprised that you aren't prepared to say that. But I have another very serious concern about an energy question, and that's Petrochem. Would you clarify for us your position on
Petrochem? Just a moment, please. Mr. Clark, you comment on the first point, and then you can move to the second.
You'd like it probably be better, Mr. Broadbent, if we both cooled down a little bit and
I'm very cool. I just want some honest,
this debate this way. Sure. We think that we can in all likelihood, have the deficit lower after the end of the first fiscal year in which these programs are in operation than we will going into it. That can't be predicted with absolute certainty. Nothing in this world can, but we believe that can happen, particularly since we're going to be at the same time we're cutting the taxes of Canadians to help individual Canadians contribute to economic growth. We're also going to be cutting the cost of government. We may disagree on that, but that's my position.
Well, if we've talked about deficit, you had your question on the economy, maybe we could shift ground to a different topic. I don't see how you're going to avoid with your kind of spending proposals having a massive deficit, but I have argued in this country we need a national petroleum company like Petrocan that would be the exclusive importer of oil, particularly serving the needs of Atlantic Canada and the province of Quebec, so that we don't get into the bind we were in a few months ago with a multinational oil company threatening to cut off what was duly our required shipment of oil. We proposed it. In fact, we forced, if I may put it bluntly, Mr. Trudeau's government can back in 1973, and I simply can't understand your position on this when virtually every other country in the world, with the exception of the United States, which doesn't need it because most of the multinationals are there, why the Conservative Party of Canada is prepared to leave us being held to ransom by multinational oil companies, why you want to get rid of Petrocan.
Well, as I think you know, we certainly do not want this country to be left held to ransom by multinationals. We want a company like Petrocan in one instance, in that we want a company that is owned by Canadians, but we would prefer to have it owned by the Canadian state, Canadian citizen, rather than by the Canadian state. But we do not want a company like Petrocan in another instance, and Petrocan has yet to find a drop of oil. It's the only company I know of whose major acquisitions have been in the boardrooms of other nations.
Well, that's simply not the case. That's conservative propaganda. They're the only people doing exploration in the Arctic now. They've done it off the Atlantic provinces. In fact, they've made a good profit.
Mainly in joint ventures, Mr. Broadbent,
well, the point is, Mr. Clark, they've done it as a public enterprise. They made a profit last year for the people of Canada. Instead of our exporting the profits that now go out in oil through Shell, through Esso, through Gulf, the people of Canada, through Petrocan, are now making a profit, and we've got an enterprise that, in fact, is the only one doing the exploration in the Arctic now. The big multinationals aren't even there. And it's your party that wants to get rid of that and leave us back to the situation we were with the multinationals.
The point is that Petrocan has yet to make any discoveries. They may well. I hope they do. I'm convinced that they will be more successful as a company if they are not only owned by private Canadian citizens, but also directed by people whose expertise is in the oil industry and not in government, because I think that, among other things...
That's precisely what they have. They have a lot of experts in the field.
I'd like to finish, if I could, sure. Also, with an ability to attract, because of that kind of management, the kind of excellence in the oil industry that very often will not now stay with a state company because they fear that some of the geologists do, that might affect their ability to go to other companies. But let's deal with the international question for a moment. You say you want Petrocan to be there in a position to purchase when we have emergencies. We certainly have to have that capacity. We had it before Petrocan. The bargain wasn't very good, but the people who are now with the National Energy Board, who are now expert in international oil pricing, are people who, I think, in an emergency, would probably be able to protect the Canadian national interest far better than Petrocan does. And I certainly agree with you absolutely about the need for us to have in this country a policy of energy self-sufficiency that will stop the foolish situation where the 5 eastern provinces of Canada, which happen to be the 5 poorest, in many ways the 5 most dependent upon energy, are left to rely upon foreign sources. And what I say to you is that your kind of policy, I fear, would drive away those private sector companies, which are still going to be highly important, still are highly important in exploration in this country.
Can I make just
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your comments on this question.
Good.
Let's move to the next one. I'm sure we'll get back to this issue. Mr. Deborah, please.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I was afraid that Mr. Broadbent was going to run through my whole list of questions before I got in here. Mr. Broadbent, as you know, the MacDonald inquiry has been sitting during this election campaign, and it's one of the issues that hasn't taken a great deal of precedence or public attention. Mr. Clark has said that he would permit police violations of civil liberties under certain circumstances. He may want to clarify that. Your own party has professed to be outraged by violations of civil liberties committed by the RCMP. Is there a real substantial difference between yourself and Mr. Clark on that, or is this just a matter of campaign rhetoric?
Oh, I think there's an unequivocal difference. I was very surprised and somewhat concerned, I must say, in a liberal democracy to hear Mr. Clark make the statement that he did. For me, it is a defining characteristic of a democracy that there's one law for you, Mr. Deborah, there's one law for the man or woman who farms outside of Moose Jaw, there's one law for an auto worker in my constituency, and it's precisely the same law that holds for the police and politicians. You can't have it both ways. We saw in the United States what can happen if you have a practice in which, in that particular instance, the President of the United States opted for what I understood to be Mr. Clark's position, namely that the head of a government can, in fact, transcend the law of the nation. Well, I think that goes against the whole spirit, the whole essence of liberal democracy, and therefore I, in the context of this campaign, made it abundantly clear if I were Prime Minister, I would not adopt such a policy.
Mr. Clark?
The problem that I think that you're not facing, as I understand your position, and I can certainly sympathize with your position, is what does a nation do if suddenly on a Tuesday night there is some extraordinary, unanticipated threat to the nation's security? Do we convene Parliament back and have an emergency session that will stop that emergency, whatever it is, from happening? The problem is that in the real
Clark,
world...
excuse me, there is within the law, and I'm not a lawyer, but I know this, if there are reasonable and probable grounds for believing an illegal act, whether it's violence from another state or internal violence is going to occur, within the framework of law that we now have, that's authorized. The police can take action, a politician can take action, but that is still within the framework of law.
But the problem we face, Mr. Broadbent, is that this matter, which may arise, may well not be within the normal course of menaces that might occur to a national security.
What kind of
I can't speculate. I'm not an expert in questions of threats to national security. I can distinguish. Excuse me for a second. I can distinguish.
Excuse me, Mr. Clark. Continue, please, and then we'll wrap up this question with one more comment.
There are two kinds of threat here. One of them has to do with the mail opening activities. Clearly, if that kind of thing which recurs is going to go on, that has to be authorized by a statute, by Parliament acting. What worries me is that we have circumstances, or we could have circumstances, where there is not a recurrence and where there is not time for Parliament to act quickly. And yet action has to be taken to protect the Canadian national interest. So what I want to do is...
All right, I'm going to finish this up later, but definitely a very interesting look at the way that debate used to occur between the perspectives of different parties, and interesting the context of the time, the leaders,